Jezebel is one colorful character. Elijah is her counterpart. So we have Elijah and Elisha, two rather similar characters. Neither one of them really fits the Deuteronomistic mold all that well. You know, they do tend to offer sacrifices. Elijah certainly does, you know, in places where he shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah.
And that there are other problems with them besides. Some people think Elisha may have a little more historical credibility, maybe, but at least in the case of Elijah, there's a fairly obvious theological point to all the stories.
Sure. There's both that, and there's, you know, as you say, it doesn't really fit well with the Deuteronomistic approach, which is, I should say, is one of the reasons to think that this Elijah and Elisha material is, you know, is one of the sources that
is older.
It's older.
Yeah.
It's being used by, and
Yeah.
Elijah is has a lot of Moses going on. I mean, with sometimes direct reference, he goes to the same mountains, he does the same fasting, he's 40
much.
days,
Yeah.
the whole thing.
Yeah.
But his real, you know, he exists in the story to counter the foreign worship that is introduced, so the text tells us, into Israel through Jezebel and Ahab.
And the classic showdown is who is God? Now, of course, Elijah's name means Yahweh is my God. That's his program. That's is what he's running on.
Yeah.
And you're going to get then this classic showdown on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal.
Yeah.
And the question is, who can produce the rain?
Yep.
That's basically it. It's not which of these gods has the better moral code.
Right.
You know, or gives you the more edifying stories or whatever.
Right. Why does Elijah not come out and say, "Where's your God's Torah?" Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist. Right. It's not part of the story. So instead we get this famous showdown: one prophet, Elijah, against the 400 prophets of Baal.
Yeah. Now they note 400 because prophets seem to have run in packs.
Yes.
And we'll see this again in a minute if we get to Micaiah ben Imlah, that typically kings had hundreds of prophets on call, as the Deuteronomists would say, who ate at Jezebel's table.
Yeah.
All right. So the king supported them. And the kings in Judah had these as well.
They did, although it's funny that almost every single one of the prophets that we know, both of these sort of narrative prophets and the literary prophets, they all seem to be like the outsider prophets who are there to tell the king that they're doing wrong.
Yeah.
Right? They agreed. The kings surely had a stable of yes prophets, right?
Yeah.
But the prophets we know are the ones who, you know, challenge the king, and Elijah is the first example, really. I mean, Moses played both roles, but Elijah's the one who's there saying, you know, you're doing stuff wrong here, and that becomes like the prophetic norm. Yeah, Isaiah and so many others.
Yeah, and now his way of saying you're doing things wrong is quite different from one of the first prophets the only prophet really we had met in Samuel was Nathan.
Yeah.
Now, Nathan is, by our colleague Bob Wilson, distinguished between central prophets and peripheral prophets. There must have been a whole lot more central prophets to start with. Nathan seems to have been a central prophet. And when he wants to tell David, you know, you really shouldn't have bumped off this man to marry his wife.
A parable, a story. He gets at it roundabout.
He winds him around and he wins him over. Now, we'll have a similar story with Elijah with Naboth's vineyard. I mean, similar in the sense that the king has done something egregiously wrong. And now, how is Elijah going to address it?
Yeah.
He's going to tell him, the dogs will lick up your blood.
Yeah, he's a little more like putting up a billboard that says, you know, you're all gonna die soon.
Yeah, and in some ways he's more paradigmatic for the prophets that come later, for people like Amos. But he just comes in with both guns blazing. Now, the story of Naboth's vineyard is interesting because it shows that he has some other concern besides the rain.
Right.
And I think, the rain is still maybe the primary concern. But he's also concerned with the rights of the little people and its resistance to the growth of the monarchy.
Yeah, so somewhere underneath this story, right? The story is fairly simple, right? There's this guy named Naboth who lives adjacent to the royal properties, and Jezebel wants to take over his property, and so has him falsely accused of a crime and then killed, and then they take his property. It's obviously a terrible wrong. It is also, it seems to me, a pretty clear manifestation of exactly what Deuteronomy had told us was the kind of thing that kings were going to do.
Yes.
Right? It's Deuteronomy warns against kings sort of overstepping their power, and then Samuel, right, warns just before the kingship before Saul becomes king. He says, you know what your kings are going to do? They're going to take your property. They're going to make you. They're going to do forced labor. They're going to take your wives and your kids and like all these things. Solomon is a little bit of a demonstration of that for sure. And this is, I think, a really clear sort of narrative expression of exactly the risk of a king.
And there is no doubt about it. That's what kings did.
Sure.
This is highly realistic, and it tells you a lot of the appeal of these peripheral prophets, at least, that a prophet had some kind of authority that he could pit against the authority of the king. Very few of them did, I think. But
my question is this. Yeah. Did he actually have... I mean, the story, obviously, is that he's the hero. Elijah's the hero. Did Elijah actually change anything? Did anything change as a result of Elijah?
If you take the story at face value, he got rid of about 400 prophets of Baal. Both he and Elisha are quite bloody-minded.
Sure.
Hamas, total slaughter. That's what he does. But it doesn't change anything.
Right.
Next week you'll be back to, if 400 prophets of Baal get slaughtered, next week they'll get 400 more.
Sure.
That isn't going to change anything. Now, but the feature that interests me in that story, I think, is what was thought to show divine power. And it's things like produce the rain, produce fire from heaven. That's what most people were concerned with. Now, you'll get this again now with Elisha.
Right. Though his miracles, and Elisha is more the miracle worker, right? He's like, not to jump too far ahead in the story, but Elisha is more like when you think of Jesus. I'm going to turn water into wine. I'm going to raise the dead. I'm going to feed a bunch of people. Right? That's the kind of miracle working that Elisha does.
But he also has a few other nice ones. He can make an axe head float.
Yeah.
Now, actually, this is the kind of thing you get in the apocryphal Gospels about Jesus. The kind of thing Jesus did in his spare time in the apocryphal Gospels that didn't make it into the canonical ones. And probably my favorite story about Elisha is when kids start chasing him and calling him bald head.
Yeah, I mean, what would you do, though, honestly? Surely you too would call bears to attack them.
If you had the power to call bears and the bears would come, I guess it would have been.
Yeah, it was a funny story, but I mean, it's interesting how many of the stories about Elisha are really stories about authorizing prophetic power, right? I mean, he's in a sense, when he goes and does these little miracle-y things, he's doing it to help one person here or there, or to help a small community. He doesn't then turn around and say, and therefore, follow the Torah.
Right.
So I mean, what's the purpose of all of the little miracle
He's
stuff?
what would be called later on a holy man. And that is a person who taps into divine power. And divine power, I figure, is like electricity. It's quite amoral in a way.
Yeah.
You get this in the books of Samuel too, when the poor devil leans his hand against the ark and gets electrocuted on the spot.
Yeah.
So, but prophets can somehow channel that. And, they're not concerned really with doing this just for Israelites. When Naaman the Syrian comes along, fine, you know.
Yeah, I'll heal you. Here's sure.
Yeah. And another of the really interesting stories in that cycle is the one about the king of Moab who is losing a battle and sacrifices his son.
Yeah, I mean, so it's so interesting because you bring this up in the wake of you talking about sort of divine electric power.
Yeah.
You know, this is a case where Israel is fighting with Moab, and Moab is losing, and as sort of a last-ditch effort, the king of Moab sacrifices his child.
Yeah.
And Israel retreats. Which is to say, it's almost as if, it's almost as if, they think about this in terms of gods fighting each other, right? But it's almost as if, Israel looks at that and is like, oh, like, you're too crazy for me, right? Like, if you're willing to do that, like, we don't want, we'll wait until this passes. And of course, what's wonderful about that story is not only what it tells us about, like, the conceived efficacy of human sacrifice, which is to say, it was thought to be efficacious, if wrong. But also that this is, one of the wonderful stories that has this terrific external bit of evidence in what's called the Moabite stone or the Mesha stele, which is maybe really the only piece of writing we have from Moab, which is this monumental text describing Moab's victories over Israel by the king in this story. I mean, you can one-to-one correspond the two things. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, and it credits the god of Moab with a certain amount of power. Again, morality isn't the issue.
Sure.
It's power. And I think most people in the ancient world would have believed that all gods had some power. And the issue with Yahweh was more that he was supposed to have more power than the others.
But I'm sure the Moabites said that about their God too.
Exactly. Also, in the story of Elijah and Mount Carmel, he has great fun at the prophets of Baal crying out to Baal and nobody answers. Now, I would figure, Baal was worshipped for a couple of thousand years. Some people must have felt he was answering their prayers. People settle for a very low batting average with answers to prayers.
Especially when it was really mostly prayers for rain. It did rain.
And it did rain eventually.
Exactly.
That's right. Yeah,
Exactly.
And I mean, it's much the same. Then in Israel, you'll be told you are a God who hides himself, which is to say, you may go missing for long stretches, but you'll come out eventually.
Again, mostly with rain.
And this would have worked the same way, I think, with Baal and the others. Now, when Elijah makes a great exit.
Yeah, we should all go up in a chariot.
Yes, there's a great takeoff on that in Joyce's Ulysses, where a character, after an argument in a pub, a character walks out like Elijah ascending on his chariot. But and then Elisha, we're told, now, of course, one of the things to be mentioned about Elijah then is he wasn't thought to have died.
Yeah, it's interesting to wonder, I don't think that's in the text, right? That's to say, I think that people reading it, Elijah becomes the figure he becomes.
Yeah.
The herald of the Messiah eventually. Many years, many centuries probably later than this text was written. But it does say something about his status as a prophet. This doesn't happen to most.
It's really only Enoch, Elijah, and perhaps Moses, because no one knew his burial place.
Right.
And so, since he had been taken up to heaven, the idea was he's got to come back. He has unfinished business. And that's why you get this expectation of the return of Elijah. Yeah. In the meantime, Elisha gets a double portion of his spirit and goes off working miracles right, left, and center. Now, one of the more consequential things that Elisha does in the end is anoint Jehu. Elijah, incidentally, had been told to anoint Elisha as prophet after him. He isn't actually said to do it. But later on, you will sometimes get prophets called messiahs or anointed ones.
Yeah. It's really interesting to think about the way that the role of prophet is construed in the Elijah-Elisha cycle. Because, again, it's everything from sort of Everything from a Moses-type prophet figure to a Jesus-type prophet figure. The anointing of kings, that's like, that's obviously very Samuel-like. All these various different bits and pieces of as we try and understand the role of the prophet, these stories where they're so central actually, I think, make it rather difficult to nail down one single thing. But the idea that prophet, we talk about prophets as like speaking back to kings.
Yeah.
But prophets anointing kings. Where does Elisha get the authority to decide who gets to be the king?
Yeah. Same place he gets the authority to say anything he says. He claims to have a hotline to heaven.
But so when he anoints Jehu, who's believing? Who's out there going, oh, well, this must be the guy?
Well, there must be people out there who thought, but Elisha anointed him. Elisha, he could make an axe head float. He could bring a child back to life.
Yeah.
He has the power.
And does Jehu's authority come from being anointed by Elisha, or does it come from slaughtering all of his opponents?
Well, he may perhaps gets the initial impulse, perhaps from being anointed by Elisha. That's what gives him the oomph to do it. But in the end of the day, sure, it comes from slaughtering all his opponents.
Right.
And of course, the final act of slaughter is the most spectacular of the lot.
Indeed, the death
He
of
comes
Jezebel.
in and Jezebel is looking out her window and he says, throw her down. And they throw her down and her blood spatters the pavement and the dogs come to lick it up to fulfill the prophecy of Elijah. Bloody stuff.
Well, as was the world then, and prophets at the forefront of it, it would seem.
Yeah.